Hi, thank you. Leah, can you please confirm that you see my normal slides, not the sort of the weird slide deck you have?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yep.
So my name is Sasha Poquet, and I am a research fellow at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning in University of South Australia, Adelaide. And the title of my talk is Why Birds of a Feather Flock Together. And I'm going to jump right in because I always run over time. And so I'm always also a fast speaker. So probably I will be talking too fast. So if you have any questions, please do keep them in the Q&A. I will come back to every one of you with whatever it is I gloss over. So this study, why this study? More and more education right now is blended and online. And the implication of this is that who you talk to online increasingly forms a part of your social environment. And so as a researcher, I'm wondering if that's the part of my social environment as a student, what peer influences are good to design for, and what forces shape these influences so that we can enrich the experience that the students have. Peer effects is a well-defined construct studied by many different disciplines, not just in education. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that peer exposure affects academic choices and educational attainment. This kind of research is done on friendship roommate studies with self-reported networks looking at the attainment over long periods of time. Peer exposure also affects learning in systems like intelligent tutoring systems having granular effect on granular learning outcomes. Now, in learning analytics, we actually we have a lot of studies that look at neither of the two, but just look at sort of the communication patterns between different students. And what the literature in learning analytics so far has reported is that we see homophily, meaning people with similarities talk to one another. Often it's about their grades, so I'll keep it that way. Homophily based on performance. And normally the studies report that based on evidence from one or two courses. So small, take one course, study the networks of speakers and discussion forums, and they say, okay, well, people with similar performance tend to talk to one another. Now, before I go any further, I have to explain something about homophily. So what you see here is homophily. Two nodes, similar characteristics have a tie. That's what we see in LA studies. But what we don't really talk about is what causes homophily. It could be that two blue nodes didn't talk on day one and they talk on day two. So the homophily is caused by selection. One node chooses to talk to another node. It also could be that it's caused by influence. So a red node talks to a blue node on day one, and then blue node influences red node, and on day two, we see them two blue nodes talking together. That would be an influence mechanism. And so I'm really interested which of these cause peer effects in digital settings. And so with colleagues, we have done this analysis where we look at homophily in digital networks in 3 universities, really large-scale study, not the one I'm talking about, but it's related. And we found that there's a lot of homophily at scale across these 3 university contexts. And we also found that most of it is selection, meaning a blue node doesn't talk to a blue node in time 1, but then starts forming a tie with one another in time 2. And so this study asks a very different question. It asks, well, what we really observe. We know that that's what happens, right? The blue node, so a performer with a good grade and another person with a good grade, they don't talk to one another, and then we see them talking to one another. The question asks, is this really a social selection process that causes that homophily? Or is it just actually a network autocorrelation? These people don't actually choose to talk to other people of similar performance, but there are other factors that bring them together in the same place at the same time, and they form a tie, and we think that this is selection because that sort of looks like that mechanism, but in fact there are other things forcing that, that we can observe that. And so maybe it's pedagogy. So good learner and another, so high performer, another high performer do their assignment on time. And so they start with a particular assignment. Maybe it's time when they post that brings them together. Or maybe we just have a lot of blue learners in the course. And so that has nothing to do with their selection of one another, but it's just the way we have structured our curriculum that causes this observed similarity. And so this study that I will be talking about is a thought experiment where I manipulated some of those simple variables that form the raw data of what is used to build networks to see whether it will change, whether that manipulation will change the homophily we observe. The data I'm using comes from one of those 3 universities that we used in the study that I noted earlier. This data set covers more than 3,000 students, their online interactions over 4 years, 1,200 or over 1,200 courses online and blended. Any course that had any interactions was taken into a data set. So some courses had 1 post, some courses had more than 4,000 posts. It's all over the place. And I also considered the GPA, meaning I took course performance and averaged that. So we look at the mean of 3, max of 5. I'll talk about later. So what I actually had was the data structure that looked like that you see at the bottom. We have a student ID, their GPA, the post ID, the thread ID, and the timestamp. I've seen enough data in my life now coming from these systems. That's very, very standard. We didn't use any text. And so from that, I built networks and looked at whether there is, what's the average difference in performance between all the pairs. So the colors here indicate performers, but you can just think of it as similarity. So if blue student and a blue student here, then the difference between them is 0. And this would be a difference depending on what the sort of the grades are. Now, how did we build the networks? I used the approach that we developed with Jelena Jovanovic for this paper we presented last year. So we took posts and we looked at the time when they were posted within the same thread. And then we only built networks between the posts where the time between posting and replying was lower than the average time threshold within a time period. And so once the network of posts was built, then from that we inferred the network of students. So it's very important conceptually because we don't start with building networks of people, we actually start building a network of posts because the posting behavior is, in my view, the most fundamental process that forms online interactions. So basically, that's the observed data. Now, what about the experiments that I've conducted? Right, so I'll come back to the outcome variable a bit shortly. The experiments were as follows. First, I randomized the timestamps. So this is just an illustration of what that would look like. So basically, I took the original data set and shuffled the timestamp of the original data set and constructed from that 20 alternative networks with shuffled timestamp between them, built the same networks, measured the same homophily or average difference between the performance of 2 learners, and compared it to the observed. And for randomizing time, I did it in 2 different instances. So I randomized time within the course. So that was one type of experiment. And I randomized time across the entire data set, just sort of to control for the effect of the course. So that's 2 experiments. The next set of experiments was randomizing the thread ID, so destroying the structure of where students post in the course, whether that's a place where they sort of come together and choose to interact with one another. And again, that was randomized in a course. So basically, who posted in what thread was destroyed. And that was randomized in a course and across the data set. So that's a total of 4 experiments. And the last bit, so the last 2 experiments was randomizing performance. So here I have the same structure as the observed data, but I just destroyed the relationship between a student and their grade. So they still made the same post at the same time in the same thread, but their grade was different this time around. And I shuffled that, created 20 alternatives, built 20 alternative networks, compared the homophily, or not really come up, but the average difference between people talking to the observed. And the results. Oh, wonderful. I didn't think I'll get here in half the time. That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this slowly because there's a lot of information. On the y-axis, you see the normalized rank difference of performance. So basically, let's just look at year 1, and that difference is 0.7 in standard deviations of ranked performance. We ranked it because in the original study, we were comparing 3 universities. So all the measures here are consistent with the original studies because we were looking at different types of grades and different grade distributions. So it was important to keep it that way. So here we see that in the observed data set, out of 57,000 dyads, the average difference in performance between them is 0.7 standard deviations. And the standard deviation in that course was 1 grade point. Okay, so that basically is something to keep in mind because it helps interpreting this. And so several things you see on this slide, and this is only for the ties where the frequency of interaction was 1 to 3 times. Okay, so I've done all of these, but I'll explain just for the sort of less, not very frequent ties. And so what you see here is that basically that surprised me. That was the biggest surprise I had because I was convinced it's the time. I was convinced if you shuffle the time, you're going to destroy the entire thing. And it's the time that causes the homophily. And it wasn't. Basically what you see that these two last line here, so the blue and the red, but they basically two last bar plots. When you shuffle the time and you build networks, 20 shuffled networks, and then you put an average of that and plot it here, the homophily observed in the network is similar to the observed, meaning time has absolutely no, it doesn't destroy what you see. It's not the time. What also surprised me that it wasn't the threads. So here you see this is quite different. If I shuffle the threads in the course, so that's the third bar plot from the right on every one of them. Generally speaking, that difference between people is similar to the observed. The first one, the black one, is the observed, meaning that destroying the relationship of who speaks to whom in which thread within a course actually does not explain homophily. Meaning people don't really choose who they talk to in a course. You can shuffle that all the way around and you'll see the same homophily. So it's not actually a social process in that sense, which was, well, that was expected, time wasn't. But what surprised me was that if you shuffle the threads across the courses, then you start seeing the explanations, which basically suggests that the course design that puts particular threads in some courses and not in others causes this aggregation of people and threads in courses. Obvious, fine. Well, another thing that's quite interesting, I think, so we've talked about number 2, that's about the threads, effect of threads across courses, and I think I have the last. Yeah, okay. So then another thing we see is that overall homophily decreases in more, people who are more similar tend to talk more as the time continues. So students in year 4, actually, the difference between them is less than 0.6 standard deviation. So that means that on average, the difference between two students speaking when aggregated across the entire university is basically less than half a grade on average. So like a student whose grade is 3 is on average talking to a student whose grade is 3.5 or 2.5. That would be the average. It doesn't mean they don't talk to people who are further away. It just means that when you average that, that's going to basically disappear to what that's a lot less of that. And then another finding that to me is very important here is that when we randomize the course grades, well, when we destroy the relationship between the course and the student, we see that there is a large discrepancy between the observed difference between the grades in token students and the basically the one in simulated networks. And you can say, well, that makes sense, right? Because you're measuring the similarity between students. Sure, it does. But what's striking is how small the difference is even at random. It is a little bit over 1 standard deviation. So even if we completely sort of, if this process of who talks to whom is random, they still end up talking to similar others. Now, we don't know whether it's good or bad because it's really, we need more differentiated insight as to whether we're seeing good students or bad students and which courses, all of that. But I think in general, to me, that was a very striking thing to see is that, and that is, so because with this data we've seen across 3 universities, this is one of the higher ones at random. In the other universities, it's even less. At most random simulation, we still have these very small differences between students talking online. Now, I also wanted to show the somewhat different result from looking at dyadic ties for interactions that are more than 10 times. So before we only looked at ties between students who were basically spoke to one another once or twice or 3 times, no more. This is 10 or more, which could be like 40 times or 50 times as well. I don't have the distribution here, but it goes higher. And so this is where you can, so again, I'm going to walk you through the data here a bit. On the y-axis, you see these normalized differences. The black bars represent the observed data, or rather represent the sort of the shuffled networks. And I want to turn your attention to this last bit in year 4. So what you have here, this is the observed difference, and it's small, right? So basically we see that overall people who talk to one another frequently, that difference between who talks to whom decreases even further as time goes by. But also here we start seeing the effect of time and thread, because we can see that basically that shifts, and of course all the other stuff as well. So that's expected. So I guess I'm going to move to the implications. So what are the findings? This is, and some of the reviewers made a comment like, well, are these patterns significant? They are significant because we're comparing things statistically across simulated and a small number of simulated networks. However, I would like to talk about these as patterns at the moment, because there are a lot of caveats as to how you can simulate or change the simulations to produce something different. These are descriptive patterns, in my view, that point out that there are factors that are in our hands as educators that affect the way similar students talk to similar students. So similarity, in my view, suggested by the data, is an artifact of the grade distribution. And now something that may not have come out strongly when I was explaining the methods, but I didn't shuffle students with performance across courses. I only destroyed the relationship between the student posting and their grades, which suggests that it has, what we see here is the biggest impact of this homophily is the grade distribution of students posting on the discussion forum, not necessarily enrolled in a class. And that's an important, I think, difference, but it's not really well tested here in terms of the alternative. So similarity is an artifact of grade distribution, likely that of forum participation. Time and content within the course, so that's the thread nodes, they play little role. I mean, I'm sure they play some role in some courses, but when you aggregate that across a large sort of data set, that doesn't seem to show any differences with the observed data if you just destroy those relationships. But the sort of the thread, destroying the threads across the courses does, which suggests that there are some courses that are designed in a way where threads play a role as to how students aggregate, and some courses where they don't. And then importantly, because we don't see the same effect when we destroy the relationship between posting in a thread in a course, that suggests, again, we can argue, and probably there are courses where this doesn't hold, but at a larger level, this suggests that these are not the social processes. Basically, going back to my original question, is that a social process of people choosing something? Do we intervene on a social process? Or is that an artifact of something, the way we arrange and triage people into the courses, assignments, timing, like we control all of these factors as educators. And it suggests that it's not a social process. But that there are social processes that become more prevalent in more frequent exchanges in later years, which also we could expect that people probably take classes together, and that sort of is, I'm happy with that finding, let's just put it that way. It makes sense to me. So what are the implications? I think, again, at this point, I wouldn't be very sort of hung up on the data, like she found these patterns. I think the data supports a question that really asks, well, what are we offering students? And what social environments, what social capital, what opportunities to transcending between the sort of the initial conditions they're given when they start the university, what we're offering students if the interaction with others is merely online. And we know that if we keep things as they are and aggregate that across programs and randomize whatever we can, is that the difference between who talks to whom is still going to be pretty similar. How much stratification within the social environment are we creating by the lack of an overview across courses? Because we normally don't study these things across courses, just in one course. And by the lack of intervention that monitor how similar people are and when the similarity takes place. And finally, I'd like to move to sort of, I think in the future work, the work that we're doing now with colleagues across the large data set of these 3 universities. So we are trying to understand these different grade distributions and homophily observed in courses of different design. Thank you. Perfect.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. That was my experiment with the sound alarm going there. I'm always interested in your social network work, Sasha, and I follow your papers, so this is really interesting. And I'm sure that people in the group have questions. They haven't put them in the Q&A, so I'm going to butt right in and ask a question and give everyone else a chance to formulate theirs. So my question, of course, I know you can imagine what I'm going to ask. I want to ask the so what question. Why do we care about who's talking to who?
So we care because
and what should we do about it?
We care because there's a huge amount of evidence that shows that sometimes it's good to be surrounded. Well, think of the keynote this morning. The keynote this morning focused on the fact that people with similar characteristics, never mind the performance at the moment, right, affect others in a positive way. We also know from sort of theory, learning theory point of view, is that if you sort of from the cognitive constructivist point of view, if you interact with people who are a little bit better than you, you're likely to push your zone of proximal development. So the bigger picture where this sits is that I think sometimes it's good for us to be surrounded by similar others. Sometimes it's good for us to be surrounded by different others. But we rarely look at these patterns. We rarely look at them aggregated. We always think, well, what's happening in my course? But the reality is the student's context is not just my course, it's all of them together. They form something. And so what influences does a student encounter through these courses? And I mean, right now it's not a big deal, right? The students still have their friends and there's a lot of face-to-face stuff happening, but especially with campus closures, right? So there's more, that's all they have. Or for people who are taking online courses, that's the influences that we are creating for them. So is it important? It's important for identity development. It's important for their learning. And so the so what is that I think we need to understand really well these stratifications that we create as educators, because my research, and not this one, but also from last year, suggests that a lot of these things are not social process per se. They become that, but they become that much later. It takes a lot of time for the online setting to develop a social process, and a lot of things are just emergent from the way other factors interact, including the content, right? So the content is not even, I'm not even touching the content here. So I don't know whether that addresses it. I think another thing that we've been thinking through here is that how can we show the instructors these patterns in a simpler manner? So what's the participation of people? Because when we talk about social learning, everybody jumps into the content. This is a bigger question. This is a question about the social environment a student is experiencing.
Yeah. Thanks. Colleagues, I invite you to jump in with questions. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, please go ahead. We have room for a couple more. Or if you can't, oh, here we are. Someone has posted, Shunfei Lee has first said, thank you for the great talk. And then asks, I wonder if students have a tie if they post at a similar time or they reply to each other. I think you addressed the time issue, didn't you?
Right. So in this study, the students had a tie when they posted in the same conversation. So if, let's say, I posted something and Leah replied, and she replied within the same day, but not 6 weeks later, we'd have a tie. But maybe then David replied to Leah, and he also replied within a day, not 6 weeks later, then all three of us actually will have ties because we all participated in the same discourse creation activity within a time that's lower than an average of what people find themselves replying. So that's how the networks were constructed. And so what the study does is that it tests whether if we change the time when these people posted, whether we will still see the same thing. And it shows that the time makes no difference. So it doesn't matter when we post it, we'll still be connected. So it's not the time that drives us together, but something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have one more question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I wonder how is it in the university? So how do we understand as the time change, like from year 1 to year 4, we will observe this difference because it seems that are they in the same course or we are observing the same kinds of course, but not the same students?
Right. So we are not observing the same course. So the data set here looks at the same cohort. So let's say you and I enrolled in 2012 in a university. You're in medicine, I'm in biology. This data set covers all the data that was available for the period of time it was, for all the courses, everything. And we're building the networks of people who were participating in online discussions starting from that cohort time. So we have some data of some people posting in their year 4 and year 1. They may not be the same people because it's, as the other study shows, it's absolutely, it's almost impossible actually to do that temporally, even at a large scale. The data just shrinks to basically hundreds from thousands. And trust me on that, okay? So here, what we're seeing is that on average, in general, people who post in year 1, the differences between them, so if you and I were in the same conversation, in the same course, we had a tie, the difference in grades on average between us was X. And in year 4, the difference will be smaller, which suggests that there is more selection or more homophily, more similarity. People tend to sort of cluster towards one another more as the time goes by, and particularly in conversations that are more frequent. And there, then you can claim some social processes taking place, but you can't claim those processes earlier on in, let's say, year 1. I hope that addresses it, but if not, we can just take it on the forum. I'll happy to unpack that a bit more. I think Bodong has a hand.
Bodong does have a hand, and then we'll have to ask that one very quickly, but I can see new questions appearing in the Q&A, so there's room for follow-up. Take it away, Bodong.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for the excellent talk, Sasha. I really find this talk really refreshing, and the way you're doing this simulative experiments, and also the findings are really like point us to a lot of different directions. Really appreciate the work. My question is more at a very micro level. I think you might imagine, like, I'm interested in the timing of student participation, and then also how this course is designed to provide different opportunities of social encounters among students. So I'm wondering really quickly, if you do a simulation based on the timing profiles of students, so at a student level, not randomly assign the timestamp across all posts or for a course, but based on how the student might participate, what's your kind of hunch about the result of that simulation?
So I learned very well that my hunches are usually wrong. So I'm going to start with that. I think what you're suggesting is one direction for future work, which is we really need to understand how these patterns form at a micro level as an effect of things we do. So let's say if you have a weekly assignments, who talks when and what homophily you observe. If you don't have deadlines every week, will that change? And you can look at the same kind of patterns, but it's really that relationship with the different factors and the way students pick it up. I honestly, I thought it was the time when I started. I thought it was a one simulation. I was just going to check. And then it was 6. So I think I don't know what you will observe, but I think it's a very good research question as to what are the relationships between these things at a micro level, because if we understand what we can do as educators, then we can start sort of aggregating that across courses and understanding these patterns better. Thank you so much.